display will be related to the quality of the prism, but also to the light. Every prism is displaying the entire light, and that's one of the most important points I want you to get by introducing archetypes this way. So the very first one would be our prism of one, which would be a very simple deal, wouldn't it? And if a prism really only had one face, it would actually still cast an image back behind it. And here we have all of your capital letters: being, goodness, light, that which is most real, that was the unchanging. And we brought that out last week, that unity is actually, I mean, all of the archetypes reveal something about the way being really is, okay? I'm not quarreling with it, we really are all one, okay? That is a true revelation that takes place with this, and also the attainment of the realization at this level is an advanced attainment. I mean, we're at the summit of things if we actually realize and feel and know deeply that we are all one. That's a very special experience, and it is possible to have this experience. I'm not putting it down. I'm simply saying that there's not a lot to work with from the standpoint when you're in the world of one. There's not a lot of intellectual content. There's not a lot to work with. You're talking about God as all that is. Okay, I'm good. I'm down with that. It's just that if it's really all that is, I can't use my mind anymore. There's no distinction between one thing and anything else. It can't change. Unity can't change. If the unity were to change, it would be what? A one at the end of the chain, so it wouldn't have changed. So we do lose a lot by, that's all I'm saying, is it's possible to make some real mistakes if you start trying to use your mind here. Number one, the mind isn't going to get you there. And number two, the mind isn't going to draw proper conclusions off of this level because there's not enough to work with. I mean, you show me the person that understands infinity, and that will be the one that can explain this archetype. So this is what I'm saying. Be careful of this, because these are all interchangeable in a certain sense. And then last week I mentioned that during the medieval period, I'd say we wasted 600 or 700 years quarreling about this with the idea that God couldn't change, because everybody was so set on the notion that God was one. And that does, one, and Plato had the same thing, one, changeless, immutable. Okay, and that's probably not a very good portrait, because it is only God looked at from, again, one particular archetypal angle. But let's go ahead to 2, and with 2 as a prism, we're into our dual world, and this, we spent a lot of time on this one last week, and we could spend easily a whole course on this. The main point that I was making was that with all of your dual units, we're again on a very, very, very simple, almost simplistic level from an archetypal or symbolic standpoint. And hence we can use our mind a little bit here, but it's very easy to make mistakes. It's very easy to fall into stereotypes. And I would say that even the greatest of thinkers, which I would put Plato, who was a great dialectician and renowned for his use of logic. The man must have had an IQ of 862. He makes mistakes. Even Plato makes mistakes all the time, handling dual qualities. And if you get good at this, what you learn is that within the world of the 2, there are families. But it's almost impossible to draw analogies from A to B. In other words, man is not to woman as culture is to nature, or head is to tails. And so half of these halfway fumbling deals where you try to make analogies because there's 2 things, and then you think you can make an analogy from your other 2 things, and usually you can't do it. You cross boundary lines of different types of families, and the conclusions will never hold up. And so what I'm saying is that as a thinker, when I look out in the world and I see people making errors, 90% of the time it's because they have mishandled a basic binary. And the basic divisions, I'm not going to spend, we can't do the class on this now, but I did mention that the two big ones to look out for is the difference between a polarity and an opposite. Because everything is totally different between these two families of dual units, everything. Opposites are mutually exclusive. The presence of the one is the absence of the other. If I have light, I just replaced all the darkness, okay? You either have darkness or light. And the light's either on or off. The electricity is either flowing or not flowing. There's a level at which binaries are very simplistic, presence and absence. And then some oppositional contraries are also compatible to each other, and others are not. But the notion of polarity is quite different. Male and female are polar energies. Mommy and daddy get together, and when the two combine, they are creative because of their creative interaction and capable of being creative and producing a third thing. Opposites can't do that. So you're just going to make mistake after mistake after mistake if you don't bother to track down what the families are, what the characteristics are. The biggest problem is good and evil, obviously. These are entirely different than the other sets. Good and evil are a judgmental set. And evil is not related to goodness as light, or as darkness is related to light. Evil is related to goodness in the way that a disease is related to something that's healthy. And that's different from either of the other two, isn't it? Because that's not just opposition. Within that relationship that we just talked about, you have something that's healthy and then a disease that's been introduced into that healthy organism. Well, they aren't mutually dependent. The disease is not equally as important as the healthy. The disease is dependent. So there's you see what I'm saying is, and then with good and evil, even with good and evil, what we're doing is making metaphors. We don't realize that we're doing it, but we're making metaphors. And even in those cases, we need to track the metaphors down because half the time they don't hold up. So what I'm saying is be very careful in this whole area, especially, remember that the biggest thing that we have as far as our Christian tradition is judge not. Didn't Genesis say something about even using the tree of good and evil? There was a tree in the middle of the garden that had something to do with it. I think we were supposed to not eat the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. So we have been properly warned of exactly what I'm talking about. It's a question whether we should even be using some of these dual categories. And you can see there's just a tremendous difference between they're everywhere. They're posited on every level. Our world is up and down, left and right. In your biological world, in your social world, you have rich and poor. I mean, in the body, you have bilateral symmetry. Actually, you're encountering dualism and dual patterns and dual qualities everywhere. In logic, you have another whole world of how things are related by true and false, which is not exactly the same as the relationship between good and evil. And it's not the same as the relationship between presence and absence.
Isn't the yin and yang symbol, black and white? Black has the white dot and white has the black dot, kind of, in a sense. Well, it has a circular aspect.
Yeah. Yeah, that actually is, it's called the Tai Chi, and that's from this tradition. The oldest statement about yin and yang is in the I Ching, in the material in the center of the book. That statement probably goes back the full distance, maybe 3,000 years. So it's disarmingly similar. I would translate it, one yin, one yang, that's Tao. And that's kind of what's in that diagram, is one yin, one yang. That makes your whole. But see, that was Taoism. When we moved to 3, this was the one that we said, well, we've already been working with a little bit with the trigram of thunder. And what I was getting at primarily here was trigram line 1, line 2, and line 3. And that's pretty much nature, humankind, and heaven, working off of your horizon line. But they do have the beginning, middle, and end. Line 1 is the beginning, line 2 is the middle. By the way, the human position has always been seen as being in the middle, isn't it? The Buddhist way is the middle way. And Aristotle's analysis of ethical action said it was always the moderate action, the midway action between a vice that was too much and a vice that was too little. And then we said that with 3 you could describe time, past, present, and future. So you can also describe growth, because you have, and this is very primal, the roots, the stem, and the fruit. Now, thunder would have been a rooting kind of energy in that sense. And so you can see on these, we can actually go through inner mind, the world of nature. You can go through, and any of these formats can be formats that you use for the interpretation of any trigram, where it turns out in our trigram we combine the 3 and the 2. That's all you need to do to understand a trigram, is 3 and 2. The lines are nature, humankind, and heaven, and on every level it can be either yin or yang. Now human beings can be yang. If the yang line is at line 2, human beings are reactive. You know, we're going to have to start to get that going so that we can understand the trigrams there. But that would be everything, wouldn't it, about our free will? And the trigram there is about free will, believe me. And that's what's so beautiful about this archetypal arrangement, is that it actually does repeat, and the meanings actually do carry. And so what happens when our human being at line 2 is yin? Receiving. That, and again, you have to work off of your basics of yin and yang imagery in order to get the right connections. But I think you can see that when we're talking about yin, we're talking about the way we receive the world, the way we receive the world. We're talking about human consciousness. And so everything to do with how we form beliefs, that's going to be part of fire symbolism. Fire is light, is consciousness, and how we see things. Fire is the eye and the act of perception. And so all of the symbolism just fits so beautifully. Do you see what I mean? And then water, which is where we have the human being being yang, that's the water, the energy of life and going forward, and that's humans as acting. With every increase, again, in the number of facets, we're getting more and more detail. Now, I made the point last week that when we had, you notice that when we had 2, we had heaven and earth, and that when we had 3, we had heaven, earth, and humankind. So there was repetition. Heaven and earth were always there, right? Why would that be? Following our analogy, it's because light is always being broken down, and there's something like heaven in the light and something like earth in the light, and every time you break it down, you'll get either a detailed version or a not detailed version, but it will be the same things that are being broken down. So that is something I want you to understand, that in a sense, these number symbolisms cover the same ground. Each one of them is going to tell you about the relationship between heaven and earth and how that fits in with human beings. And when we get to 4, it's just more detailed than it was at 3. And we can handle different types of issues. Now there's a lot, earth, air, fire, and water is a 4-fold pattern. And you guys know how primal that is. I said that the number 4 has a lot to do with cycles and with the geometry of the earth, the north, south, Now, for those of you that have been following the class all the way through, I'm going to say that ultimately we want to get onto wheels, and north, south, east, and west are going to be on the wheels. And the wheels are going to look a little funny because symbolic wheels have the south at the top rather than at the bottom, but it doesn't really matter. But these wheels are going to be fourfold wheels, and they're going to go from the east up, that's spring, and that's also daybreak. And that's where the light comes out of the ground, or when the light is just starting to grow, and then it goes up to the south at the high point. And that's where the form is at its highest. It's summertime. The plants have they've had so much sunlight, they've been able to grow. They're very articulated. So it's a high point of growth. And then that would be where the heat is the most, summer and noon, if it's the day. So the course of the day and the course of the year are both being plotted on the same circle. The east is where things get started. The south is where the heat is at its height. And then the west is where you go underground. It's autumn. And it's the time of death in the cycle. The hero is going all the way down and is now about to enter the underworld. Okay, so we had east, south, and west symbolism over here. West symbolism is autumn, death, going into the darkness, and then the north is winter. It's as cold as it's going to get. Yang is destroyed, yin is totally ruling, and so the cycle begins again. So the cycle of day and night, and the cycle of year. Last week I introduced the four causes. And I can't repeat that, but it is very essential for the understanding of fourfold symbolism, and we'll come back to that. Every individual being can be described. You have a mandala, right? And the mandala can describe anything. That fourfold pattern that I just described, it can be a chair, it can be your human individuality, anything that is a being. And that's how generalized, that's what archetypes are. They are that general. You can describe any kind of being. With the four causes, the material cause tells you what that being is made out of, what supports it, what is the constituent of its form. The formal cause tells you the shape, what it's doing, the intelligible aspects of it. The final cause tells you why it exists. And then the moving cause points to all of the things that help to bring it into existence. I know that sounded abstract, but if it was a human being, the ultimate, that out of which the material cause that we're made out of, that could be like Jung's collective unconscious. Okay, it's like a giant reservoir of history and biology that we sit on, that we came out of, that our forms evolved out of. So the material cause would be for humanity, and then we are our parents were the moving cause that brought us into the world. The formal cause is the pattern in your body that causes you to grow into the form that you're going to have. And then the final cause would be, why did it all occur? What's human life all about, by the way? Does anybody know? I wouldn't mind having a hint. Okay, it's occurring for the sake of value development, and so that your consciousness can be expressed in a world, and so that you can develop values through relationship. So that fourfold pattern can help us because it's such a generalized archetypal pattern and can be applied to anything. And by the way, that was what I was going to do with you. I thought it might be a little fun maybe to stop it for, because all of the Jungian functions work off of four. And I thought it might be fun to illustrate this by jumping over to Carl Jung. Anybody know about his fourfold division between the intuition, the intellect, excited about that. So I'll skip it. But yeah, Carl Jung will work out real well. The material cause will be the collective unconscious. The moving cause will be like his personal unconscious. That would be over in the West. And that's the driving force in the human psyche. In other words, that's the world of all of our desires and all of our impulses, the things that drive us into action. The East is Jung's ego. And then the South would be Jung's higher self. You see? So these fourfold patterns really will repeat. And when I give you something like Aristotle's four causes to help understand on this, you can apply it again and again. With 6, the I Ching is built on a fundamental pattern of 6. That has to be understood in terms of, remember that we said that this is like meditative algebra, where the units retain their basic meaning, but you get to apply them and reapply them again and again. With 6, it becomes very interesting because the most important one is probably 2 times 3, because the trigrams, like thunder is a trigram, 2 of them combine to make a hexagram. So that's our fundamental interpretive tool. And that's what I'm saying. These archetypes are so organized that you use the same interpretive tool all the time. One trigram is always below, and the other trigram is always above. The one that's below tells you the subject of the hexagram, and the one that's in past and the one that's above represents the future. The one that's below represents what's being worked on. The one that's above represents the active principle, subjective, objective. All of those dual patterns we went over will work when you're talking about the way the lower trigram relates to the upper trigram. Well, we just had 100 interpretive tools handed to us, because in some cases, the upper trigram rules over the lower trigram. If we were going to go ruler-subject, it would be upper-lower, right? So whatever the theme is, in terms of those 2 underlying energies that are in combination. For instance, in hexagram 16, down below is earth, up above is thunder. You cannot understand 16 unless you can relay the symbolism of thunder being in the upper position, outer world. Okay, upper trigram is above, without, and in front. Lower trigram is below, within, and behind. So sometimes you need behind and front, sometimes you need above, below. The upper trigram rules, the lower trigram is ruled. In hexagram 16, you have thunder over the earth. Thunder over the earth. And it's called the army. And it is about armies marching, making sounds, and the way drums and music inspire people. That's the text. Now, can you relate that to thunder over the earth? Yeah. See? So that's when you get the sense that, hey, I'm starting to understand this hexagram, is when you're able to take your trigram meanings that you've developed and then genuinely see them as components of the story that you're being told in the hexagram. And one reason that you need to do that is because it's your job to do the interpretation. And I'm talking now, if you're ever going to use an oracle, it's your job to interpret it. The oracle does answer correctly because of the principle of synchronicity. When you ask a question and you throw the coins, or you deal cards or whatever, things happen at the right time, the inner reflects the outer, you're getting the right answer. But that's going to be a question of interpretation. It's 100% of the process is knowing how to interpret wisely. And that's another reason for the underlying study of the archetype, because when you actually read the I Ching book, okay, well that's that's everybody else's experience with this archetype. It's very valuable and stuff like that, but it's still going to be your job to figure out, what does hexagram 16 mean today for me in this situation? And that's the last step. And that's what is in superstitious approaches to oracles, that's the step that's skipped. People pretend like there's no interpretation, or like the oracle just told you, or I just told you. And there's always an interpretation. Human utterance always involves interpretation. We can't help making interpretations as we go. So the point then becomes, and what we're trying to teach here, how do you make interpretations consciously? Well, you get yourself some background and you spend some time on it, like with music. You know, you could play really good music if you had a good feeling for music, but why not learn the notation? And then you can talk to the next guy, and it gives you common ground, and it does help you to build your sophistication in music, to go ahead and learn music, even if you were talented without, you know, needing to do it. So, upper trigram, objective world, subjective world. Then when you go to the 6 times 1, then we have it that each of the 6 lines of the hexagram has its own traditional symbolism. Line 1 is the infant, you know, down at the bottom, just beginning the journey. Line 6 is the great sage, who is the height of wisdom, who is just ending the journey of human life. Line 5 is the ruler, or would represent the ego. And you can keep going through the traditional symbolism. They lay out a specific, like when you got line 6 moving, you got line 6. That means in your situation, what was changing was a change occurring on the spiritual level. You see, and that's why I'm saying, you can't skip this process, because any corner of what we're learning about might be the most important thing for the consultation that you're doing. It might have been the most important thing that you got a 6th line, because they may have been saying, hey, direct your energy right now into the direction of spirit. That would be very different if you got it moving line 1 or 2. See? So that's what I'm saying. All these interpretive elements have to be looked at carefully and studied, but then you know how to combine them. It's like learning music. Once you know how to play the scales, you can play any song. I would ultimately relate the symbolism of 6 to the cube. The cube involves the symbolism both of 6 and of 8. The cube has 6 faces and 8 vertices. And a cube represents 3-dimensional space as such. We are in a cube in this room. Cubes are a 6, and that 6 is a 4 and a 2, right? 4 walls, ceiling and floor. The ceiling and floors are opposite of each other, and the 4 walls are the same thing. Ceiling's above, floor's below. Ceiling has light, floor gives you support. Okay, so all of these relationships are polar, but all of the windows are the same thing. They open you out to the open world. And if the house was properly aligned, the windows would face north, south, east, and west. So you'd have that going on as well. So the 6 in a cube is a 2 and a 4. 4 walls. And then the vertical dimension, which is opposite. The I Ching itself ultimately can be represented as a giant cube, because you have 64 hexagrams, each is an upper and a lower. And so it's a Rubik's Cube with 4 layers, and 4 layers this way, 64 times 64. They can all be laid out. So you have a big cube with 64 little cubes inside of it. Weirdly enough, I believe that just as anything that goes on in 3-dimensional space can be plotted inside a cube is good enough to describe 3-dimensional space. Everything about 3-dimensional reality All you need are those axes. And they're the same as the I Ching, above and below, within and without, in front and before and behind. Okay, so the three axes, or the three axes of a cube are the three lines of a triangle. And I believe that it honestly is the case that significance has that pattern. In other words, that is a pattern of the permanent possibilities of significance within three-dimensional space. I do believe there's only so many kinds of significance here, and that they are actually coherently ordered. There's only so many things you can think, there's only so many things you can feel, and weirdly enough, I believe there's a kind of mathematics of it, an underlying coherence. And this is why I compare these types of archetype. Have you guys seen the periodic table of the elements? Okay. The diagram of the periodic table of the elements is very much like these diagrams I'm showing you here. Because what they went with was the hidden mathematical regularities within molecular and atomic form, right? And they built it out. One electron here, 2 electrons here, and guess what? Everything started falling into families. Wow! And these families had common characteristics, right? Like all the inert gases would fall down on a line. And so coherent were these interrelationships that they could actually predict where there was an empty spot and nobody had found the element with that property, and then it would be discovered. So the periodic table of the elements is a very close analogy to what we're doing here, because all that is doing is tracking the families. Hidden as hell. Really hidden. I mean, you really have to know a lot about matter, physics, mathematics, and everything else to even figure that those... I think it's a great cultural achievement that we came up with the periodic table of the elements. And it was a discovery, wasn't it? It wasn't an invention. I mean, it wasn't something that we did, it was something that we found. It was regularities that actually existed. And that's the way it is in significance, believe it or not. In this study of the archetypes, it's exactly the same thing. You can get your hands on human significance and find out the kinds of values that can be created in human life. It's rather a stunning piece of news in my view.